Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Maritime Matters podcast. We're recording on Friday the 13th of September. Welcome, Jen. How are things? How have you been? It's been a little while.
It has. I've been good. I'm very relaxed. I've been on holidays. Not talking maritime, although did get my sea legs. So I went on the ferry between the North Island and the South Island, which is the only sea time I do these days. So that was great fun. Didn't get seasick, really positive. How have you been?
I've not been too bad. Not been doing anything remotely like that fun. I've been a little bit of maritime related stuff. I had an article out. I can't remember whether it was we talked about it last time, but I had an article out in Rusi a week or so ago. I also had a blog out talking about uncrewed vessels again, back on an old hobby horse of mine. But primarily enjoying teaching our undergrads and trainee officers here at ADFA. So what's been up? What's been happening in the region this week?
So lots. In fact, so much so I don't actually think that we can cram it all in. So, I mean, we talked last time about the Red Sea and the vessel that had been hit. It is continuing to be in the middle of the Red Sea needing salvage, with all sorts of back and forth about whether there was agreement on salvage or not. We won't go into detail on that. There's been issues again around Sabina Shoal since we spoke last. In fact, the Chinese threatening to attempt to tow a Philippines Coast Guard vessel, which would be a significant escalation. Sydney is up. HMAS Sydney, that is up in East Asia. We will talk about that a little bit. There's stuff about strategic fleet. Exercise Kakadu has commenced. Lots.
So let's start by talking about Exercise Kakadu. Do you want to give us the rundown? What's happening this year?
Exercise Kakadu. Well, Exercise Kakadu is a really interesting exercise, actually. So it commenced in 1993, but it has continued to grow since then. It's conducted about every 2 years. At one point, Exercise Kakadu actually had Chinese ships invited. Not for too many iterations, but that was kind of a high point of the military relationship. In fact, my favourite Exercise Kakadu story, I won't name the country, but one of the ships, when I was working at Maritime, one of the ships at sea, or maybe at anchor, one of their personnel jumped overboard to try and, migrate to Australia. But they jumped overboard in Darwin Harbour, which is full of crocodiles, which creates a really big search. They ended up stranded on the other side of Darwin Harbour with crocodiles around them. Anyway, that is a partially factual story. If you're listening and you know that actual story, then feel free to email us and correct the record. But it's a really funny story. But Exercise Kakadu this year, it's interesting. It's not exactly clear what is happening. So normally with these exercises, certainly with Talisman Sabre, there's a big announcement, a big opening that's covered by the press. We know exactly which countries are participating. We know the kind of serials they're doing. We know the breakdown. This year, the defence release about Kakadu didn't really say that much. So they've said it's the biggest one ever, which it's not quite. Last year was bigger, but it says it's about 3,000 personnel participating, 32 countries, 13 ships, 1 submarine, 10 aircraft. We know that HMAS Stuart and Warramunga are participating, and HMAS Collins, and we know that the USS Dewey is participating, a destroyer from Japan, a ship from Canada, which is pretty cool. I'm not sure the Canadians have participated too much in Kakadu. And there's also clearly a Vietnamese ship participating in Kakadu. But we don't actually know what the other countries are, which I thought was a little bit interesting. In terms of the types of activities they're doing, there used to be a bit of a conference with Kakadu. That doesn't seem to be the case. There's clearly some sort of commanders conference going on. I saw a photo of lots of fleet commander equivalents looking at it. I was trying to spot the female, but couldn't find one. And yeah, that's what we know about Kakadu this year. Have I missed anything?
No, I'm not sure whether it was specifically HMAS Collins or if it was listed as a Collins class submarine. I'm not sure. But
You're right. You're probably right.
the thing that I found, again, sort of slightly surprising is that we know most of what we've just told you from the American press release about this and from tweets from the JMSDF and the Canadians, and actually trying to even find out what Australian units are involved from an Australian side is, unless I missed something, has been quite challenging. So, yeah, a little bit odd in that kind of regard. And I don't really quite see why there's been that little bit more kind of or lack of, not transparency, but lack of a big announcement about what's going on, particularly as Pitch Black got quite a lot of coverage, right? So
Pitch Black kicked some goals in terms of strategic communications, right?
Yeah.
And you think about, every press release now, every government announcement, we're talking about something to do with maritime. You would have thought that signalling about kind of Navy's preeminent naval exercise, or I guess maritime exercise to correct the record, would be important to the domestic audience, who are coughing up increasingly more money to the defence budget, 38% of which over the next 10 years, or 38% of the IRP is going towards maritime. But you also would have thought it might have been some good signalling to the region, especially since there are probably a number of regional partners participating. I would suspect there is Philippines representation, for sure. Normally there is Malaysian representation, Indonesian representation, so they're probably there. I suspect there's an Indonesian warship, although I don't know. You would have thought it would have been a great opportunity to get some great strategic comms out there for internal and external. But yeah, there's not much.
Elsewhere, we talked a little bit last time about the missile attacks on trade in the Red Sea. Notably, in sort of the past 24 hours, there's actually now been an attack on a merchant vessel in the Black Sea, and this is quite a significant step up. So obviously, we're moving outside the region now, but I think it's definitely worth talking about. So reporting is a little bit unclear. So we're getting this from the Ukrainian side. So it's always worth taking this with a degree of a pinch of salt, as always with these sorts of things. But the reports are that the MV Aya, which was a sort of 28,000-ton bulk carrier, registered in St. Kitts and Nevis, but Turkish operated, was carrying grain from Ukraine to Egypt, and it was hit by a very large Russian anti-ship missile fired from a backfire bomber. This is sort of, apparently it just left Ukrainian waters and was in, as far as we can tell, the Romanian EEZ. So significant step up. Obviously, the Black Sea Grain Initiative that kind of got grain flowing back out of Ukraine after the initial sort of lockdown in 2022. That expired in 2023, and the Russians have been trying to limit Ukrainian grain sales, but they've done so in a relatively cautious way up until this point, and they certainly have not been explicitly targeting merchant vessels in this kind of way. So it will be a quite a big escalation if we see this kind of trend continuing. The vessel, as far as we can tell, is still afloat, which again points to how tough merchant vessels are proving to be and how resilient they are to these strikes, and is in a Romanian port. So hopefully we'll get a little bit more clarity about this over the next few days, but something that's definitely worth keeping an eye on if this becomes more of a trend. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and thankfully, should note, thankfully no seafarers were killed during this, but that's by accident rather than by design. Interesting, I think, there's been a lot of talk about the reduction in the Russian Black Sea fleet through Ukrainian attacks with missiles, UAVs, and of course USVs, uncrewed surface vessels. There had been some Russian harassment of grain shipping. They had actually managed to shut it down during parts before the agreement was put in place, etc. But I think some of that obviously disappeared because the ships were not comfortable operating that close to Ukraine because of, Ukraine's really effective sea denial campaign. So this is obviously a different way to target those ships, and I'm wondering if that's, Russia sending a message that we're still going to reach out and touch you. We haven't agreed to you transporting grain. I think from a wider perspective, it's important to talk about these things because, we often talk about how vulnerable Australia would be in the event of a crisis or conflict. And this just brings home again that in the event of a crisis or conflict, merchant shipping will be targeted and does need to be defended. That's a wider conversation that we've spoken about a lot, but I think it can't be highlighted enough, especially when you have 10 surface combatants.
Absolutely. You mentioned HMAS Sydney. What's HMAS Sydney been up to?
Yeah, well, HMAS Sydney's been up to a lot. In fact, that's been they've had a pretty good deployment, Sydney. So they did all the RIMPAC stuff. We spoke about their firing of naval strike missile, first RAN unit to fire naval strike missile. Now they're obviously in East Asia. They've certainly been to Cambodia and a few other ports, but they've just announced that they are now undertaking Operation Argos. And if you go to one of our earlier episodes, if I was organised, I'd be able to tell you which one, but I don't know which one. We did a bit of a Did You Know about Operation Argos. Operation Argos is, of course, the RAN name, the Australian Defence Force name, for sanctions enforcement on North Korea, attempting to intercept vessels smuggling in components supporting their nuclear program. Interestingly, HMAS Hobart was on Operation Argos in May this year when their helicopter was intercepted by a P-Lane aircraft. We spoke about that. Flares were deployed in front of it. So Sydney is back up there. It'll be interesting to see if there are any interactions with the PLA. I suspect not. There is a sense that those things are winding down a little bit, but not too sure.
We mentioned there about some of the kind of sense that some of the tensions are sort of dropping a little bit, and I think one important sign of that has come through in the past week or so, and this is the announcement, firstly, that there was a video conference between Admiral Samuel Perro, the commander of US Indo-PACOM, and General Wu Yanan, who's the commander of the People Liberation Army's Southern Theatre Command. And there was a little brief kind of readout of that conversation that was released by Indo-PACOM. And then shortly afterwards, there was a story that apparently General Wu is also expected to visit Hawaii in the next week or so as part of the annual Indo-Pacific Chiefs of Defence Conference. So this is something that certainly the US has been indicating that they want much closer sort of communication and this kind of bilateral communication on a military level, particularly obviously with Southern Theatre Command, which is sort of where there's been quite a lot of tensions recently. So I think it is clear that there is a desire or acceptance of the need for these kind of to rebuild some of these connections, and it's certainly been something that hasn't happened for a couple of years now. So
yes, since 2022. So they cut off military communications between the two countries. China cut off military communications between the two countries in 2022 in response to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
Yeah, so hopefully this is a positive sign, but it's always a little bit difficult to read the tea leaves. But beyond that, what are your thoughts and takes on this?
Yeah, look, I think I'm always a supporter of communications is positive. I remember when the incident occurred with HMAS Hobart's helicopter in May, there were some commentators in Australia calling for the Chinese ambassador to be kicked out of Australia. And I find that a little bit laughable in terms of when you have a crisis, that is when you need ambassadors and that is when you need communication. So I think it's good, but we're still seeing these incidents around Sabina Shoal. It was literally only last week that we saw some comments anyway from a Chinese spokesperson saying that they might well attempt to tow the Philippines Coast Guard vessel, which of course would be a violation of international law. And so I think that we just need to understand that the nature of the relationship at the moment is one of instability in the military domain, not one of stability. And, there will be some wins like this in terms of communication, but that doesn't change the underlying nature of the relationship. And I think it's interesting too, it is the commander of the Southern Theatre Command for China, which of course, as you mentioned, is one of the biggest concerns has been the potential for one of those dangerous encounters to escalate to something else. And that has been predominantly occurring in the South China Sea. But interestingly, there's not been communications, or at least reported communications, with the commander of the Eastern Theatre Command, which actually deals with the Taiwan Strait, of which there have been increasing issues in the Taiwan Strait as well, including, and we won't go into detail on this, but threats issued against Germany this week when Germany announced they were going to sail a frigate through the international waterway that is the Taiwan Strait. Largely positive, but I don't think it means that the dial is moving left in any way at this point.
Do you want to briefly touch on the Australia-Japan 2+2 and give us a brief rundown?
I will very briefly. We have a lot to talk about when we get to the capability discussion points. Look, as we said at the start of this podcast, there has been a lot happening in maritime in the last 2 weeks. You kind of think that maritime matters, potentially. I thought the 2+2 between Australia and Japan was worth mentioning. So 2+2, obviously our foreign minister and our defence minister met with the equivalents in Japan. As expected, there was a pretty heavy defence flavour to the conversation. I thought the most interesting thing that came out of it, which hasn't actually garnered much attention or discussion, is the agreement to host a JMSDF liaison officer at HQ JOC, Australia's Joint Command Centre in Bungendore. Hopefully they tell him how to drive to Bungendore and avoid hitting a kangaroo, which everybody that posts a JOC does. I did my last week at JOC. But I thought that was really significant, actually. That's probably the most significant. That's more significant to me than the reciprocal access agreement that has been signed, the Japanese F-35s operating out of Darwin. That's a different type of relationship. But from a maritime standpoint, there was agreement between the two countries to continue to support the Philippines Coast Guard. Japan has donated some vessels to the Philippines Coast Guard. There has been a lot of calls for Australia to support a lot more, either in the gifting of ships or financially, because we do know one of the biggest challenges for the Philippines at the moment is actually being able to respond to China's aggression at multiple flashpoints in their EEZs. We've seen Sabina Shoal, we've seen Scarborough Shoal, we've seen Second Thomas Shoal, but there's a whole bunch of other areas as well where China is flooding it with maritime militia. As a quite bit of a side note, there is a great piece out in the Council on Geostrategy. I've just forgotten who wrote it. There you go. I've forgotten how to speak English as well. I've just forgotten who wrote it, but it is out. Check it out. It gives the history of China's claims to the South China Sea, and it gives it probably in the best way that I've seen it written. But it talks about, and I never heard this term before, it talks about China's approach to dealing with some of these flashpoints as a cabbage leaf operation, which you're shaking your head, so you're nodding your head, so you obviously knew this, you're much knowledgeable than me. I had not heard that term before. I thought that was interesting. The cabbage leaf term being the idea that they have the inner layer, which is flooded with maritime militia around the feature, a secondary layer, which is Coast Guard, and the third layer, which is the PLAN sitting over the horizon to respond. Anyway, that is a huge tangent from the Japan 2+2, which talked about supporting the Philippines Coast Guard, but I thought it was interesting, the cabbage leaf operations.
Moving on, because we need to.
Before we move to capability, given that we are halfway through this show, and we haven't even spoken about some pretty cool things, including the decommissioning of HMAS Broome. But more cool is the JMSDF and their aircraft carriers.
Yes. So the Azumo class helicopter destroyers, as I think they're officially referred to, in a effort, or at least they were referred to as helicopter destroyers. I don't know if they're still, despite the the fiction that they're a destroyer was difficult to maintain at the best of times, but seems even more absurd once you get them converted to operate F-35s, which is what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
So the lead ship Azumo underwent a sort of minimal conversion, a light touch conversion initially to operate F-35s. Her sister ship Kaga underwent a much larger conversion, including the rebuild of the bow. So they look much more now like the American, particularly America class kind of LHDs. And Kaga is now off to San Diego in order to do tests with American F-35Bs, because I think the Japanese ones are on order but are not yet there, and so they're operating with the Americans to sort of test out the newly converted vessel. And I think Azumo will then go back into dock for the much fuller conversion that Kaga has been through. So really interesting to see this taking place, and a significant kind of step up in JMSDF capability. This sort of move from being very much a ASW-focused force, and these were, I think, initially at least, very much viewed through an ASW lens. They're now obviously being able to operate fifth-generation fighters. Very, very different kind of capability.
It is. And I really kind of applaud the JMSDF for their, I guess, ambition, and ingenuity in achieving this. And I am dying for someone to write a piece about converting the Australian LHDs, Adelaide and Canberra, to becoming effectively like a fleet carrier, light aircraft carrier. Now
I'm sure you can
that,
rely on some of your former ASPI colleagues to pick up that baton. We haven't had an ASPI strategist on F-35s for the LHDs for at least 6 months, so I'm sure it's another one's due.
We should. Well, have we had one? I haven't actually seen anyone. I've seen who's written one.
Malcolm's written a few. Yeah, go back a little while, and there's a whole debate.
Some of your writing. Well, I think the debate needs to be reinvigorated. Now, I know that whenever you talk about aircraft carriers, the Royal Australian Navy, you are immediately dismissed as an idiot. Which it is not necessarily something that there is capacity to embark on at the moment when you're talking about expanding the surface combatant fleet. You're talking about trying to integrate capabilities. You're talking about AUKUS. You're talking about all these other changes. But I would point out a couple of things. One, the Adelaide and Canberra class, and I'm happy to be proven wrong on this, but I think once the Army achieves their 8, what they call it, landing craft heavy, so 5,000-ton vessels, similar to the size of HMAS to Rook, I do wonder what the role of the Adelaide and Canberra class is. Now, controversial comment, not done a lot of analysis, happy to be shot down on that. But they have no defensive capability apart from, I think, Seawees has potentially been installed. So I think there is a real question about what their role is in the new kind of amphibious setup. I'm not very articulate today. It's a Friday. So I think there's an interesting conversation there. They are, of course, the same as the Spanish Juan Carlos, which does operate Harriers, and in fact, the same as the Turkish light aircraft carrier, which I don't actually think has any aircraft. But the Turkish did actually build Turkiya, not Turkey anymore, Turkiya, did actually build an equivalent of HMAS Adelaide, HMAS Canberra on license. And until the US said no because of Turkey's relationship with Russia, we're planning to acquire F-35 Bravos to operate from. The next thing people are going to laugh is, that the Navy has workforce issues and therefore they could never, ever crew an aircraft carrier. But I would argue, and I have argued this before, if you go back to that statistics book I was quoting in our last episode, can't remember it, but it's a really good book, I'll link it in the show notes. And it talks about the size of the Royal Australian Navy. The Royal Australian Navy is almost as large as it has ever been, apart from during World War II. Now, of course, that is not necessarily a great comparison because there's all the support required now to the Strategic Centre, to Cyber Command, to Space Command, all of these areas that have grown. But I don't think it's impossible to make a decision to acquire a fleet carrier. I think there are pros and cons. I'm not suggesting this is a great idea. This is not my force design recommendation. Anyway, that's enough on it, but I think it's something to think about. Any comments? Any comments on that? I'm sure we're going to get lots of abuse now on our YouTube channel about how dare you mention the idea of Australia being able to achieve air control in the maritime domain more than whatever it is, 500 nautical miles from Darwin or whatever.
I think it sounds like a wonderful idea. I am far from sold on the practicality or reality thereof, particularly given, as you say, the incredibly ambitious program that's already underway. So that can definitely be a point for discussion in a later episode. Moving on.
I'm not sold it's a good idea. It's just an idea. Anyway, moving on.
Moving on. Talking about the strategic fleet.
Yes.
So this was a Labour Party commitment at the last election to have a review of Australia's merchant fleet. A task force was formed, and it released its report was released publicly in, I think, November of last year, the Strategic Fleet Task Force. And then there's been kind of deafening silence for quite a long time. But this week we heard that there is some progress. Some is very much the key word here. $21 million is being allocated for a pilot to try and effectively have a tendering arrangement with up to 3 commercial vessels, whereby the Australian government has basically is effectively supporting these vessels to be Australian flagged and potentially eventually to operate with Australian crews as well. So this is framed as being about building the resilience of Australia's maritime industry, and building both the sort of the resource in terms of the shipping that's available, tonnage of shipping that's available, but also the resource in terms of the people. Now, this is something that I think most people who look in this area think is something that requires to be done, and is a huge area of potential weakness for Australia. But I am still to be convinced that the government is in any way serious about actually doing anything about it. Quite frankly, $21 million over 5 years is the kind of money the government loses down the back of a sofa. This is not a meaningful step towards solving what I consider to be one of Australia's primary strategic challenges. But maybe this is the cynic in me. What's your view on this?
Well, look, I think firstly, it's positive we're talking about it, right? It's very easy to become a cynic about everything. I think we just destroyed Exercise Kakadu at the start of this episode. And Exercise Kakadu is a great exercise. It is fantastic to see all the participants. So it's easy to be a cynic. It's harder to actually address these issues. But that said, I thought the press release was a little bit laughable when it talked about the training bunk allocation. So one of the things it put down as its objective of this pilot program was to increase the training opportunities for Australian mariners, because there's not many, right? There's join the Navy, there's join the very small element of the Australian Border Force, which is the Maritime unit, and that's about it. But when it said that, it said, we expect there'll be 3 bunks a year to support this training, which is nothing. When you think about Australian Navy warships, you generally have at least 6, 7, depending on the ship, officer watch trainees on board. So 3 bunks on one of the ships is not much. And when you think about the amount of money, look, I haven't costed this, so I don't know what is an appropriate amount of money, but I would suspect in the release of the public IIP, Integrated Investment Program, this year, and the amount of projects that were cancelled, the government probably paid more than $21 million in terms of the cancellation of some of those contracts. So we certainly paid more than that in terms of the cancellation of the French submarine, but we won't go there. So, like, I think this is really it is great that the government is thinking about it, because it's easy to be critical. No government has really talked about this in a serious fashion since the 90s. And it is really important to try and address how we get strategic depth in Australia's non-existent merchant navy. And, when we think about the fact that I was going to talk about this later, but I'm going to talk about it now, we did actually have did you know? We actually did have a national shipping line. And I started reading about this recently because I was on a flight from WA to Sydney, and I was sitting next to a pilot who works out of WA somewhere, a naval pilot, who actually got his start and did his training in his cadetship with the Australian National Shipping Line, which got me thinking about it. And so the Australian National Shipping Line, it did have quite a few vessels. At some point, it was operating well over 40 vessels, predominantly Australian crewed. In the end, it was kind of privatised in the 90s and then sold off under the Howard government. But it was both the Labor and Liberal government throughout the 90s that wanted to get rid of this thing. One, it wasn't making a lot of money. A lot of that was because of Australia's industrial relations laws. But I think that in the conversation in getting rid of it, it was during that kind of peacetime dividends conversation, right? Where actually we did a lot of things to the Australian Defence Force that we probably now regret. We did a lot of things to a lot of our strategic capabilities, including our strategic shipping fleet, that we probably regret. So I think it's positive. But it doesn't really seem like a serious way in getting after it. And when you think about, go back to the National Defence Strategy released this year, the Defence Strategic Review released last year, and you think about the strategic circumstances that both of those documents outline, and we know that we are a maritime nation, one of our greatest vulnerabilities is our ability to transport, our fuel, our food, our fertilizer, our purification tablets for our dams, all those things that we're critical on, and that this is a key element of it, and this is how we're getting after it. It does feel a little bit mismatched with the threat level that has been articulated in those documents.
Yes, absolutely. I also wonder, and I think one of the challenges at the moment with regard to the strategic fleet is the question of what actually is it that they're really focused on? Is this a primarily kind of defence national security element issue, or is it more of a kind of civilian resilience type issue, more focused on natural disasters, or more focused on potential other supply chain interruptions? It's often being sort of talked about in lots of different ways, as if it's going to solve lots and lots of different problems. And actually, the kinds of scale and scope that you need to address some of those problems are, and the types of vessels, particularly whether or not you are looking at coastal vessels versus ocean-going tonnage, lots of these things play out very differently. So I think one of the challenges here is that it feels like the government is trying to be vague enough that they can kind of cover lots of bases without actually having to commit to what exactly it is that they're trying to achieve. Because quite frankly, 3 vessels, relatively small vessels, almost certainly on a coastal trade, is not going to do much in terms of your kind of economic security, broad brush.
No, and I do, I think I'm going to quote a Twitter thread, which makes me sound like a loser, but I think I did write a Twitter thread about a week ago or something about this on Merchant Navy Day, which was the 3rd of September. And I kind of feel like the way we're approaching our maritime strategy at the moment is a little bit kind of whack-a-mole. A problem pops up and we solve it. So submarine problem pops up, we solve it with AUKUS. Surface combatant problem pops up with Hunter and the OPVs, which we will get to because there's been some things with the OPVs, and we solve it with the surface combatant fleet review. Strategic fleet pops up, which interestingly was actually a recommendation in the Joint Standing Foreign Affairs Defence Committee review into maritime strategy 20 years ago, 2004. Happy 20th anniversary to that. None of the recommendations are enacted, but this was one of them. And it pops up when we solve it with this pilot. I really think that we do need to step back and look at what is, and I keep harping on about this and writing about it. Everyone's like, we don't have time for this. What is our maritime strategy? Like, For example, I'm going to throw this out there. I've not thought a lot about this. Do we need a subordinate committee to the National Security Committee, which is a maritime security committee? Many countries have that. The Philippines has that. Fiji has just announced one. Do we need one? Now, we do have a maritime defence committee, which goes across agencies, industries, etc., but that's at secretary level. Do we need something at ministerial level? How do we look at this in a holistic way? Because there are lots of gaps. You're probably rolling your eyes because I'm on my high horse, but I just think we need to have a more holistic review. If we talk about we want to increase our maritime skill set across the country, and Jeff Till constantly talks about the idea that the reason countries like Australia struggle with their naval shipbuilding is because naval shipbuilding, just like submarine building, is a national enterprise. And I think we need to step back and go, how do we holistically look at these problems? Otherwise, it's just going to be whack-a-mole. And the next mole to whack probably that's not a great analogy. Maybe we should cut that out. It's terrible. But is the Coast Guard or the Border Force issues. That's probably...
Talking of which, let's segue neatly into discussion of OPVs. This is a project which has been troubled, I think it's fair to say.
I think it's very fair to say.
The OPV project, or the Arafura class offshore patrol vessels, these have been going around in one form or another since the 2009 Defence White Paper, I think. The current iteration comes out in the 2013 Defence White Paper, but it's been around for a long time. Originally, this was going to be a very large class of 12, potentially up to, at one point there was discussion of up to 20 of these hulls. Now, that has been cut back very significantly under the Surface Fleet Review to 6. And from reading between the lines, at least in part, elements of that, even that retention has been about maintaining industry at least as much as the capability. But there has been real trouble also with the first of the hulls, Arafura, and particularly around its kind of seaworthiness and the degree to which it meets Australian standards. And so she was launched in December 2021, but has only just at the end of last month commenced sea trials. So this is a significant step forward, and it hopefully means that we might see Arafura going from NUSHIP Arafura to HMAS Arafura at some stage in the relatively near future. But there are still, even beyond that, problems around the potential armament, because the weapon that was selected for the platform, there have been all sorts of issues with, and she's currently carrying a much smaller Bushmaster cannon, which is taken directly off one of the previous decommissioned patrol boats. So good news, but in a limited form would be my kind of take on this. What were your thoughts?
Yeah, look, good news to see it getting to sea. And hopefully, I mean, I had heard rumours earlier in the year that it was going to be commissioned in 2024, but I don't know if that's actually the case or not. It certainly was meant to be commissioned in 2022, so a number of years ago now. I think that this project has had a lot of problems, as you articulated. The independent analysis team, in their review of the surface combatant fleet, was pretty critical of this capability, and more from the concept of where does it fit into the fleet structure, which actually I think they stole from my report last year that said exactly that. And so, look, I think it's good to see it getting to see. The one thing I think that there could be some benefit with this is Australia has lots of successful shipbuilding programs. It really has over its history, right? It really has. And I know that you know this a lot more than me. You've written on this, you teach on this. I don't know the details that much. Except the Bathurst-class corvette, which is a success story. We built 60 of them during World War II and exported them to the UK and India. So we do have a lot of success stories in shipbuilding. But at the moment, unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, in the public view, and for those who are not informed on the history of this, when we think about Australian shipbuilding, it often gets a lot of criticism. It gets criticism because of two reasons. One is the Hunter-class project, and the second one is the Arafura OPV project. Now, how these two projects got to where they are, we can talk about all day. And to be honest, a lot of the information is really not known in the public domain. I do think it would be more beneficial for there to be some defence strategic communications around what the actual problem is with the ship and what the plan is. Because in the absence of that, there are all these comments about what the issue is, who's to blame, etc., which is just not helping this public opinion on Australia's shipbuilding capability, which is impacting views on AUKUS and impacting views on our achievability of the expenses that are complete. So I really do think a press release and a conference just coming out and saying, hey, this is what's happened with the OPV and this is a plan, would go a long way in terms of building that confidence in Australian shipbuilding, which over the course of Australia's history has actually been really successful.
We also don't talk about the successful ones, right?
Yeah.
And we're continuing to produce Evolved Cape class quite successfully. There have been other success stories that we tend to sort of gloss over and focus on the problems. But part of this comes back to another theme that we talk about quite a lot, which is around communication. And at times it feels like we don't do ourselves any favours by not highlighting the successes and then letting everyone else talk at endless length about the failures and the problems.
I agree. Although I do think we better wrap this up thing. I think we're going to skip a bunch of things. But I do think on the communications front, speaking of not being kind of glass half empty, being glass half full, there has actually been some good examples of defence forward-leaning communication on some of these issues in the last couple of weeks. It's not maritime related, but I would commend to you an op-ed in the Australian from the Chief of Army in the last week. I'm sure we can put it in the show notes. I think that was really, really good. There was a interview with the Chief of Navy in the Fin Review over the weekend talking about the supply ships, which I don't think we're going to get time to talk about, which is unfortunate because that is something to unpack. But so I think there are some good examples, but I think that there could be a lot more. I mean, this shipbuilding thing, as we've said a couple of times now in this episode, Australia has a really successful history of shipbuilding. We're just not communicating at the moment.
I think we are very much out of time. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. We're going to make our usual assertion at the end of an incredibly busy episode where we've had to skip a whole load of things that we would have liked to talk about, including, as you say, the supply vessels and the decommissioning of HMAS Broome. But all we can say is that because there's so much going on, we can only cover certain elements of it. And this is because ultimately maritime matters, right?
Maritime does matter. And I just want to give one shout out, and I know you're keen to wrap this up. If you haven't bought your ticket, if you are in Canberra, and you haven't bought your ticket to the Goldrick Seminar, which is the Australian Naval Institute's annual maritime-focused conference, it is coming up on the 3rd of October. Tickets are available on the Australian Naval Institute's website. So some great speakers. The Chief of Navy will be there. CJOPS will be there. Admiral Jones. Jay Terriella, who is the spokesperson for the Philippines Coast Guard, will be there. Richard Dunley, some guy you may have heard of, will also be on a panel there. So check it out. Get your tickets if you're in Canberra. It is really good. And if you are a midshipman listening to this, hopefully there are some, tickets are free for you. So congratulations. You get paid a lot of money, but still tickets are free. Anyway, check that out. Maritime Matters.
And on that note, we'll say thank you for listening, and we'll be back again next week talking about all things maritime.
Thanks, Richard.
Cheers, Jen.